Marusha Sahai, the managing editor of War on the Rocks. Welcome to another episode of Horns of a Dilemma. In this episode, our partners at the Clemens Center at the University of Texas talked with Arne Westad of Harvard University for a fascinating talk on the Cold War roots of today's geopolitical trends, specifically the competition between the United States, Russia, and China. We hope you enjoy it.
I'm really grateful to be here for many reasons, from seeing old friends, but also because it is a way of finding out more about what goes on in what is really, really an exciting place for the future of this field overall. So I actually thought about what I was going to speak on with that very much in mind. So I wanted to do a talk that really tries to link the past with the present. And most of the talk that I'm going to give today is about the present. It is not about the past, but it's about using the past as a tool in order to understand, maybe in a slightly different way from what you can get from the newspapers and much of the public discourse, what is going on between the great powers in the world today. Well, some of this will be about Trump, it will be about Putin, it will be about Xi Jinping, but it will be about trying to understand what goes on now in light of who these people are and how they were formed. I mean, how their thinking in terms of what they are now trying to put into practice came to the fore. And that's not a determinist argument. I'm not saying that these people were entirely set by their pasts in terms of the direction that they want to go in today. But it sure helps us a great deal if we know a little bit more about the kind of background that they come out from and their kind of thinking came out from. Maybe not least with regard to this country, in terms of figuring out what the future might hold. So some of what I'm going to say today comes out of this new book, which was published last year, which is an attempt to place the Cold War within the longer perspective of 20th century history. It's not a book that tries to subsume everything else under the Cold War. I mean, some people who know me may have suspected that was my purpose in actually doing it, right? To figure out that everything, including what happened yesterday, is an attempt to rehabilitate the Cold War as the cause of everything that's happening. It's not like that. What I tried to do in the book is really to connect the global conflict in terms of what the future was going to hold for humanity between capitalism and socialism with other things that were going on at the same time, right? So that ideological Cold War didn't determine everything in the 20th century, but it influenced almost everything, right? Very often for the worse. Right? And I think it's important to bear those kinds of interactions in mind, even though other things that happened had their own causes, their own autonomy in many ways, in terms of their background. So, two world wars, the global depression, decolonization, the rise of Eastern Asia in the international economy and international politics. All of that wasn't created by the Cold War, but the Cold War influenced it in very, very strong ways. That's what I argue in this book. So I have two propositions to put before you today in terms of what I want us to discuss afterwards. And they are pretty simple and pretty straightforward, but they sort of tie all of this together. The first one is that the world is becoming increasingly multipolar. The moment after the end of the Cold War, when the United States, on a whole range of issues, ruled the roost almost entirely on its own, is gone. And we're going to see more of the reasons why that is gone, I think, over the next half generation or so. So the world is getting more multipolar. And as I'm going to argue later on, there isn't all that much we can do about it if we don't like it. And then secondly, that the current state of international affairs can only be understood by understanding how the Cold War ended. Not just the Cold War as an international system, that's useful, but the specific ways in which the Cold War came to an end, and which happened in different ways in different places on a global scale. All of that is extremely important to understand if you want to understand where the incentives, the instincts, the preoccupations in today's international affairs come from. So let me start with the latter in terms of a view of how the Cold War ended. And if you look at this on a global scale, I will suggest to you that the Cold War ended primarily because the economic room for maneuver of an anti-capitalist project like the Soviet Union became narrower and narrower. The world opted for markets. It opted, in this particular moment of the 1980s, it opted for a form of free market capitalism that in country after country came out remarkably similar to the rhetoric, if not the practice, that came out of the United States at the time. The areas where this was least true were actually among some of America's allies. We can come back to that later on, Western Europe and Japan. But if you look at China, if you look at Eastern Europe after the collapse of communism, if you look at the Soviet Union as it was being dissolved into Russia and the other successor states, it is quite remarkable to see the kind of change that this broader economic change led to. Now, I argue in the book that this was a moment, right? This wasn't as some people thought at the time, the worldwide, forever victory or expansion of liberal market capitalism. But it was a particular set of ideas that were really useful, really powerful during the 1980s and 1990s, and that most people in most places around the world wanted quite literally to buy into. Right? That reduced the room for maneuver of the only power that wanted to resist this, the Soviet Union, to an extreme degree. Right? When you have the Chinese, the country that had always, as a fellow communist country, been criticizing the Soviets for making too many compromises with the Americans or with the capitalists, themselves turning to work with the Americans and practicing forms of market economy, at least in parts of their overall economy. That sends a pretty strong signal of where the world is turning. So out of that particular aspect of how the Cold War ended, very significant one, the massive globalization of capital and investment that transformed the world in the 3 last decades of the 20th century came out of. They intimately connected to how the Cold War ended. And the consequences of that globalization on a world scale, it seems to me, has moved in 2 different directions at the same time. Economically, there is absolutely no doubt in my mind that the biggest beneficiary of this process was China. China went from being, when I first came there as an undergraduate student in the late 1970s, from being a dirt poor, underdeveloped country to become the world's economic powerhouse within 1 generation. The most remarkable economic transformation that the world has ever seen, including the United States and Britain at its height, because of the number of people who were involved in it and because of the speed with which it happened. This would not have happened, I argue, if it weren't for the way the Cold War ended. And if it were for the kind of constellations that developed after that, when a lot of countries, including this country, saw it as being in its own interest to facilitate the kind of market-based economic development that China was going through. So economically, the biggest beneficiary was China. Politically and militarily, strategically, without any doubt, it was the United States of America, which had, by all standards, so Jeremy referred to some of the work that I've done earlier on global history, world history, was really in a unique moment in the 1990s, where it could set the agenda for much of what was going to happen on a global scale in a way that great powers, even hyperpowers, as the French were fond of referring to the United States in the 1990s, hyperpuissance, rarely get. It was in many ways a unique opportunity, not because the United States had won the Cold War militarily, but because it had won it through its ideas and the kind of practices that the United States, at least in people's imagery, seemed to be standing for. And I also suggest, as I do in the book, that most of this unique opportunity was squandered, was not made use of, in terms of not being able to work with others to set new rules for international interaction, after the Cold War ended, to include other countries, including Russia and China, more meaningfully into an international multilateral security arrangement that could take us beyond the kind of situation that we see at the moment. And it was granted for some very understandable reasons. Most of the American public were tired of international affairs, were tired of constant emergencies and warfare, and wanted to deal more with what was happening within the country itself. And then, of course, in the second phase, this country, again for very understandable reasons, meaning 9/11, got consumed by wars in the Middle East, in Iraq and Afghanistan, which took much of the attention away from the unique moment that the United States had in order to rearrange international affairs in a broader sense. And this is the point that sort of connects to our current predicaments here. Alongside that stepping back from what could have been a reordering moment came a massive economic and social restructuring within the United States itself from the 1980s on, where this country basically, and I'm exaggerating deliberately here to get a good discussion afterwards, went from producing things, making stuff, which America has always been very good at, to high-tech development and serving as a financial center on a global scale. Within a little bit more than a decade, the United States went from being the world's largest capital exporter to becoming the world's largest capital importer. Right? Now, this is, of course, connected to what happened to the global economy, which I already talked about on a broad scale. Some of it might have been entirely unavoidable, or at least really very hard to avoid. What's clear is that when you get these kinds of changes, and Britain, where I've lived for most of the past years, is one very good example of that in the middle part of the 20th century. When you go through that kind of transformation, it always wreaks havoc with traditional centers of production, not least in social terms. And when there is no sense that your country is looking after you, when you are forced into this furnace of rapid transformation, of course there are very strong political resentments, a feeling of being marginalized within your own country, being forced out of the mainstream that goes with it. I mean, all powers that have had to change the kind of social and economic format under which they work would be suffering from the same kinds of consequences. What seems to me to be particularly striking in the American case, and this is part of what produced the Trump phenomenon, is that in the United States there were very few attempts at facilitating that kind of transformation in a social sense. Even if you compare with Britain in the middle part of the 20th century, going through the same kind of things, right? There were attempts to ameliorate the effects of this for the people who were suddenly thrown out of work or had to completely retrain in order to fit into the economy. In this country, there was very little of it. And that the reaction against that is very strong is in many ways not surprising. At the same time, the Cold War and the immediate post-9/11 situation, which had been a way of saying, there is a great international emergency out there, which could be used to discipline the US electorate from the side of the elites, was gone. There was no foreign emergency that could be referred to anymore, saying that you have to do this, you have to do that, you have to spend more money abroad because the world depends on it. Right? That kind of situation was gone. So it was very difficult in the last presidential election in this country to insist that the United States had to have a global role when it puts its own interests aside in terms of serving a systemic form of internationalism without there being a specific emergency to point to that, saying that Americans should do that. And understandably, given what was happening here, a lot of Americans were tired of that kind of being in that kind of position. And as we know from opinion polls, over the last few years, a very large number of Americans have felt that the United States are doing too much in the world, not concentrating enough on what goes on here, and this is perhaps the key aspect of Trumpism in all of this, not representing the United States' own interests well enough towards the rest of the world. So these voters, though they wouldn't have expressed it this way, what they wanted to see was an American state that did more for them, rather than doing more for, it seems, everyone else in the world on a systemic basis. Right? And that's another way of saying they want the United States to be one other country in the world. Right? A powerful country, most powerful country, many of them would say, but still one country that looked after its own interests. And not the kind of global hegemon that had to look after the interests of everyone. Or it would be challenged from the outside by the Soviet Union or by radical Islamists or others who oppose the kind of values that the United States stood for. So in this sense, one could argue within these issues, of course there are many other issues at stake in terms of the 2016 election, but one could argue that this country was ripe for someone like Trump. In many ways, he comes across to me increasingly as the first American post-Cold War president. Someone who, in ways that I generally disagree with, takes the United States out of the kind of international setting which itself had been at the center of for a very long period of time. Now, there are other reasons as well. All of you know about them. They're mainly domestic. They have to do with a lot of other issues in electoral terms. They have to do with different parts of the country. They have to do with race. They have to do with a lot of other views of the economy. But I would say that if you want to understand the transition that this country seems to be going through in terms of its foreign affairs, this is the key of what you have to understand. Now, let me then switch to talk about the Russian side of this, because these two, in my view, are intimately connected. So most of you know this already. Vladimir Putin spent the end of the Cold War as a Soviet intelligence officer, mainly in Germany. And we know quite a bit about his thinking at the time. He's written about it himself. Many of the people who worked with him have spoken about it or written about it. The young Putin in Germany, as everything was collapsing around him, comes across as a cynic more than a communist, right? He is someone who is not particularly enamored by the communist system in his home country or what he sees of communism in Eastern Europe. Actually, during the time he served in Germany, he became increasingly critical of it and voiced that criticism among his colleagues and his comrades. But he was also a cynic in the sense that he thought that no one really paid full service to these kinds of ideals. And what really mattered was the fate of his own country, which is increasingly, even during the Soviet era, seemed to have identified as Russia. In somewhat uncertain ways, but still a clear direction. Now, in spite of his embryonic Russian nationalism, he comes across as someone who was profoundly shocked, not least because of where he was placed, by the rapid demise of the USSR, the rapidity with which the Soviet state collapsed. But interestingly, at the time, he did not deplore it. I mean, he did not see this, as he later is famous for having said, as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. He regarded it as quite natural. He spoke about, a country that simply wasn't fit for purpose. It didn't work well enough in terms of the economy and social affairs to have much life left in it. What he did argue, and this is then when he made the transition to politics in the 1990s, was that only a new political and economic system could save Russia. Not to go back to the way it had been before, but to build something that was entirely new and what was based as much on Russian national interest as on anything to do with the Soviet past. But instead of that kind of Russian renewal, of course, what all Russians got in the 1990s was dissolution and despair. They didn't get the reconstitution of Russian power without communism. They got instead a deep sense of failure and of collapse. And I think this is something that, especially in this country, is not often understood, the depth of that kind of feeling. So when you go from, in one moment, and we really was talking about moments here, to be possibly a dissatisfied, but still a core citizen of what is the other superpower on a global scale, to very rapidly having a sense that you count for nothing within the international system. Your own country is being torn apart domestically, mainly, I would argue, not the way Putin sees it, but I would argue for domestic reasons rather than international reasons. Of course you get a sense of collapse. Of course you get a sense of being déclassé, right? That you value as an individual has been reduced. And I think that's a very important part of the Putin story. In his case, it's also closely connected to a deep sense of abandonment by the West. The sense that the West should have done more in a very undefined kind of way for Russia during the 1990s. Now, I believe that more could have been done and should have been done. Probably not along the same lines of what Putin and his group is thinking about. They wanted more power for themselves. But we can return to that later on. I do think that it would have been smart, for instance, from the Western side, not to have permanently excluded Russia from a collective security arrangement in Europe. That was not, by the way, mainly an American mistake. That was a Western European mistake. It was the main Western European countries that were so convinced that Russia, because of its size and because of its character, could never be fully integrated into a form of European cooperation, security-wise or economically. And I think when we look at it today, in spite of the immense difficulties there would have been at the time in declaring that that was not out of the question, politically and otherwise, it was saying that Russia was forever placed on the outside was probably a mistake. And I think on Putin's side, what you then got was the true NATO expansion, which he didn't to begin with oppose. So it is quite natural, but then gradually grew more concerned about. And especially the Western decision to use power in Yugoslavia, both over Bosnia and then more significantly over Kosovo, was something that left Putin, by the time that he became Russian president, very uncertain about where the direction was going to go in his relationship with the West from then on. And interesting, the first thing that he does when he becomes president is still to attempt to stabilize relations with the United States and with Western Europe. And especially after 9/11, I mean, trying to reach out to the United States and say, we have common enemies, which is, Islamist internationalism. And we have to work together in order to fight that. The basic problem, I think, with Putin in power is that it's very, very hard, based on the kind of background that I talked about now, to link, to integrate his view of the need for a Russian predominance in most of the former USSR with the kind of values that European Union and United States and a lot of other countries in the world stand for. His thinking on security, it strikes me, is remarkably old-fashioned. I mean, Russia can only be secure if it is a regional hegemon. He's not out to reconstitute the Soviet Union. He doesn't particularly like the Soviet Union. He likes the idea of Russia gradually coming back as a world power, which there aren't all that many signs, by the way, that is actually happening. And he certainly likes the idea of being taken seriously by others. But first and foremost, he wants to be recognized as being the leader who made Russia predominant within the former USSR. And he's set out to prove that. Now, if we turn to the Chinese side, so for Xi Jinping, I think, again, his background is essential. He grew up during the Cultural Revolution. And some of his most important memories, I think, in terms of what drives him, come out of that time period. An abiding fear of chaos, fear of China's isolation in a broad sense. No one, I think, understands better than Xi Jinping what a miracle it is that China has ended up where it is today. So his father, man very different from him, who I actually met on a couple of occasions, was a much beloved leader of the Chinese Communist Party. Beloved for almost exactly the opposite reasons of what his son is now trying to put into trying to systematize within the Chinese Communist Party. His father was known as someone who was very interested in discussing, debating issues, about thinking about alternatives for China's way forward. I remember the first time I met him after we had exchanged a couple of words. He said, "Young man," he said, "Deng Xiaoping," so China's leader at the time, says that he's been purged 3 times. Well, I've been purged 5 times, and I'm still around. So that was old Xi's approach to the world. He could deal with this, but I think his son found it much more difficult to deal with. There's much more of a fear of chaos, much more of an institutional preoccupation with reordering China according to the Communist Party and according to the centrality of the Chinese state. Still, he was very preoccupied. I think he still is preoccupied with learning about how the United States historically grew from relative insignificance in international affairs to the top position that it has today. He's known to be a very keen student of those aspects of American history. All of his close advisors, who I know when they want to get information from people like myself to present to the highest leadership, this is one of the things they really want to talk about. How did the Americans make it? How was it possible for them to become the central power? First within the region, that's what they're most preoccupied with, and then on a global scale. My answer to that is usually this was by antagonizing everyone and throwing the weight around and ask Mexicans or Canadians about the peaceful growth of American power, and they wouldn't quite agree with that. He's also a student of the economic development of the United States, and he's very preoccupied with that part of how the United States grew. And I think knows a fair amount about this, but very fearful of putting some of those same mechanisms fully into motion, because he fears the social and political consequences of that kind of full leap into the market. And that's the reason why we see the strengthening of some parts of the state sector at the moment. Not as an attempt, by the way, of moving China away from either internal or global markets, but to make sure that the state, and especially the Communist Party, have more of a say in terms of the commanding heights of the economy overall. And of course, cracking down on all kinds of civil liberties and freedom of expression at the same time. The other basic preoccupation that Xi Jinping has is with the collapse of the Soviet Union. So now you can see how these things connect, right? So most of us have come to think about the Soviet Union in its last couple of decades and China today as being very different animals, right? Completely different. The Soviet Union negated the market, wanted nothing to do with it. China has, in many ways, embraced it, right? It's not as simple as that. From a Chinese Communist Party top-level perspective, the story of the ending of the Soviet Union is still a story about how a Communist Party lost power, how the Communist Party was then destroyed, and how the state dissolved. And this is something that they are extremely preoccupied with making sure would not happen in China. Right? So some of these crackdowns that I already talked about also have their background in this. If you walk into the social sciences section of any big Chinese bookshop over the last few years, you will find very prominently displayed histories of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And they are not there as celebration, they're there as warning. This could happen here if we are not careful. And it's important, I think, to bear that in mind when you want to understand why what is happening today is happening, including, we can talk more about that in the during the question session afterwards, I hope, the origins of the current trade war between the United States and China. It's something that really puts fear into many of the Chinese leaders, because they are worried that this happens at the same time as the Chinese economy in itself is starting, if not to stagnate, at least to grow at much lower levels and in different ways than what has been the case up to now. So the Chinese are trying to stand tall in that particular conflict, but in reality, I think they're much more concerned about than what they get the impression of. And the trade war itself, of course, comes out of some of the very reasons that I was talking about earlier on in terms of US policy. So just to pull this together, Jeremy, of course, the basic problem that all of us are facing here is that neither Putin nor Xi nor Trump, for that matter, have an alternative to a US-led global system. Right? It is not as if there is some kind of alternative, well-organized multipolar world that is waiting for us out there. That's not the case. Right? So these kinds of power transitions, as we know historically, therefore tend to become very messy and very dangerous at times. And that's, of course, what we have to try to work against. And I think in order to try to move away from some of the risks that are involved, a realistic evaluation of how the other two main countries, first and foremost China, but also Russia, see themselves in broader international terms is something that is really, really important. So to me, for instance, use Russia as an example. So to me, Putin's Russia is not a global antagonist of the United States or anyone else for that matter. They simply don't have the capabilities that are necessary in order to confront the United States or Europe or China on a global scale. The best way of understanding Putin's Russia is as a scavenger on the periphery of the international system. Putin's Russia is dangerous for people who mess up their own countries, right? Like Georgia, like Ukraine. If these had been integrated, well-functioning, less corrupt states, which they ought to have been, for the sake of their own people and by their own people, then Russia wouldn't have any chance to undertake the kind of efforts that they have been undertaking there in terms of invasion and occupation of the territory of these countries. Same thing is, of course, even more so true for Syria. In terms of what the Russian opening was. So I'm not saying that Putin's Russia is not dangerous. It is. But it's dangerous only under certain circumstances where Russia's capabilities and interests align in a very opportunistic kind of fashion, where there are opportunities. There might be more of those. You never know what will happen. But that's the right way, I think, of understanding it, in spite of Putin's rhetoric. On the Chinese side, I think Xi Jinping's China has a lot to gain still from the international system that the United States has put in place. And Xi understands that. He doesn't want to break out of that system, at least not at this point in time. The problem for Xi is to figure out a way in which he can develop his neo-authoritarian leadership style at home and mix it with a good enough relationship with the United States so that China's economic rise and its rise as a main power within the region can continue the way that it has up to now. That's what he's trying to do. The big question is, under the current circumstances, not least in this country, is that possible or not? So therefore, and I'll conclude with this, Jeremy, the biggest question at the moment is not about Russia and China. It is about what's going to happen here. The biggest question at the moment is whether Trump will get the 8 years that are probably needed to deconstruct US global leadership, the way it has been executed up to now. That the United States will become, during that time, one leading country among several great powers that are out there. And if that were to happen, I don't think there is a way back from that. I don't think it will be possible to reconstitute. I mean, there will be politicians who will be telling us that they're the right person to do that, to reconstitute American power the way it was before. I think it will be very, very hard to do for political reasons, international reasons, economic reasons, not least, on a broad scale. I'm not even necessarily saying that this is a bad thing. As was probably plain from what I said earlier on, in spite of not, in any sense, embracing the current president, I think some of the kind of ideas that brought him to power in a broad sense were probably in many ways overdue. So whether you like them or not, do not have much to do with this. No great power, not even a hyperpower, can stay on top of the pile forever. It's how you organize these forms of transitions, and particularly how long they take, which really is important here. So if we know anything, my colleague Graham Allison at the Kennedy School have been writing about this and others, and this, Graham, is entirely right. Short power transitions are very dangerous. So when there isn't much time, when one leading power sort of gives up power, usually not to another state, but to a more multipolar kind of framework, if that happens very quickly, it almost always leads to war. I mean, not little wars, but cataclysmic wars. If it happens over a longer period of time, it's easier to adjust. It's easier for the leading power to find its interests in this kind of transformation. Think about the political discourse in this country today. So in a way, that is what one could hope for be happening. Whatever way it happens, what is clear to me is that our current moment is in many ways a bit similar to the international situation in the late 19th century, or to some extent, to a lesser extent, in the interwar era, so between the First and the Second World War. And of course, we all know how that ended, not well in both cases. So the pressures in order to figure out how we get through this transition period over onto something that would be more stable than what you find in these two cases, I think, is essential. And then finally, some people are referring to what we are seeing today as the new Cold War, or Cold War II, or whatever, which I find to be an almost entirely empty concept, right? Because it doesn't help us explain anything about what goes on today. Not all conflicts are Cold Wars, right? The world had a lot of conflict before the Cold War came around. The Cold War was a very peculiar kind of conflict, very much built on and constrained by the ideological premises that were there from its very beginning. What we're seeing today is not a Cold War. It is conflict, and conflict galore on a massive scale, and it includes some of the same parties that were involved, countries that were involved during the Cold War. But it's very different. It is about resources, it is about trade, it is about technology, it is about espionage and intelligence in the cyber sense, that in many ways seems much more similar to these earlier examples that I cited than anything that went on during the Cold War. I'm not saying this because I think it's so important to come up, this is what historians generally do, come up with characterizations of every particular era or age. I'm saying it because there is a real danger if people are trying to tell you that what we are facing now is a new Cold War, because it constrains in many ways what we can do about it, how we can act with regard to it. And it focuses in on insurmountable kinds of differences of a sort of deep ideological kind that are probably not around today. That doesn't mean that they're easier to solve, but it does mean probably that they could be solved in different ways from what we saw during the Cold War. So that's what I have to say, Jeremy. Thank you again for inviting me.
Thanks for listening to Horns of a Dilemma. Be sure to check out the Texas National Security Review at tnsr.org.